My name is Stephen Woolfolk. I'm the Director of Programming and Marketing at the Kansas City Public Library. And let me start by making what has become a boilerplate apology for the parking. Mother Nature has not been terribly cooperative, but I'm told they're making progress. The finish date is now supposed to be next Monday, so hopefully any day now we will be back to normal. We really appreciate those of you who endured the madness to be here tonight, as well as those of you who couldn't bear it and are watching at home, because it is truly a pleasure to welcome Kevin Lerner to the Kansas City Public Library tonight for a discussion of his book, Provoking the Press, More Magazine and the Crisis of Confidence in American Journalism. I know what you might be thinking. That sounds like an awfully academic title, and you're right. It did, after all, start as a dissertation. But believe me when I tell you that if you're going to read an academic book, you should make it an academic book by somebody trained in journalism, because they know how to research, they know how to organize information, and they know how to tell a story. And Kevin Lerner fits that bill. He is an assistant professor of journalism at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York, and edits the Journal of Magazine Media. His work has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and New York Magazine. So I would encourage you to give it a look. It's available just outside here in the lobby or as checkout from the library after we wrap up. So here's how this is going to work. In just a few minutes, I'm going to introduce Kevin. He's going to take you through the book and share with you some of the history of More Magazine. And then I'm going to join him out here, and we're going to talk a little bit about how that relates to what we see with the media today, and hopefully get you all involved plenty in that conversation. And with that, and a last second admonition to please silence your phones. Please join me in welcoming to the Kansas City Public Library, Kevin Lerner.
Thank you. I can't help but open with a couple of corrections. One, I haven't edited the Journal of Magazine Media for about a year and a half. I handed that off to a colleague of mine actually at the University of Missouri. I've been promoted. I am no longer an assistant professor. I'm now an associate professor. Thank you. That took an extra 8 months because of the pandemic and a board of trustees that decided to kick all of the promotions down the road 8 months when the pandemic hit. But it all went through. So thank you for being here tonight. That was a really interesting introduction, because I'm glad to hear that something that was written by an academic is actually readable. This book began its life actually as my doctoral dissertation, and one of the members of my doctoral committee during my defense actually turned to me and said, as a criticism, I laughed too much while reading this, you need to tone it down. Which I actually took as a compliment, and I think she knew that I would when she told me that. So this book is called Provoking the Press, More Magazine and the Crisis of Confidence in American Journalism. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about More Magazine first, and then I'll run you through the history of this as it's told in the book. First, though, the magazine is called More. Just the word More, either in parentheses or in square brackets, which for somebody who's dealing with searching in a database is incredibly frustrating. You cannot find this anywhere because, one, the word more is a very common word. Two, if you add the word magazine to it, you get the magazine for women 50 and older, also called More Magazine, which is a more contemporary magazine. Or you get every record that refers to magazines and includes the word more. And then once you put those parentheses or square brackets in a lot of databases, those are operators, meaning they tell you they're supposed to do something. And that makes it incredibly difficult and frustrating to search for. So this is very hard to search the internet for. It's very hard to find things on More Magazine. But More Magazine was a magazine of press criticism that published from 1971 to 1978. Which was a really fascinating time in American journalism. And I am a historian of American journalism. I'm largely fascinated with the period between the end of World War II and the beginning of the 21st century, so the last half of the 20th century. And More fits squarely into that. It was part of a journalism review movement that happened in the 1960s and 1970s, starting with a group of regional journalism reviews, one of the most prominent of which was actually published out of St. Louis on the other side of the state, the Gateway Journalism Review, which is still around in some form today. And More was trying to be a national journalism review. along those lines. So these are the three people on the cover. I promise you will have more fun tonight than they had at this panel. This is John Kenneth Galbraith, the Harvard economist. In the center is Marianne Means, who was one of the first women accredited to be a White House correspondent. And then on the right is Roger Wilkins, who was a former assistant district attorney and newspaper columnist for many years. This was a great image that I found helping out my publisher. My favorite thing was when we finally zoomed in on it, you can see that Roger Wilkins is sticking his tongue out between his lips. And I just thought it made a really fascinating cover photo. But more began its life with this man. This is J. Anthony Lucas, or Tony Lucas, as everybody called him. And he was a New York Times reporter. He began his career at the Times. He worked for a couple other places first, but really broke through with the New York Times. He was brought there by his college friend, David Halberstam, who's a name that many of you may know. He and Halberstam worked together at the Harvard Crimson, the newspaper at Harvard University. And then when Halberstam got his job at the New York Times, he wrote a very, very poorly written letter of recommendation for Tony Lucas. But it worked, and Tony got the job. Tony was always just sort of a step behind Halberstam. Halberstam won his Pulitzer first. He was the one who went to Vietnam. He's the one who went to cover Africa. Lucas was always a step behind getting to that. And he had a little bit of an inferiority complex. But he was a spectacular writer in his own right, and one who did win a Pulitzer Prize while working at the New York Times. A lot of his work was about the 1960s and the sort of cultural changes that were happening across America during the 1960s. He was part of a generation of reporters who had gone to places like Harvard University, which was a new thing in the 1960s. Prior to World War II, reporters didn't really go to college. The way you got a job as a reporter was get a job as a copy boy. You would run literally pieces of paper back and forth between a reporter and an editor. And you'd work your way up. You'd become a cub reporter. And it was a much more sort of hard-bitten bottle of bourbon rolling around in the bottom of your desk kind of life. And so this Harvard-trained journalism life was a slightly different thing as Lucas and Halberstam are getting into American journalism. Lucas's breakthrough story, the one that he won the Pulitzer Prize for, was called The Two Lives of Linda Fitzpatrick, which was about a young woman who had grown up in Greenwich, Connecticut. And from the part of the world where I live, Poughkeepsie, New York, Greenwich, Connecticut has certain connotations. It is a very wealthy, old money, blue blood kind of place. And she came from that atmosphere. But from Greenwich, Connecticut, she moved to Greenwich Village in New York City, which, despite having that similarity in names, was a very bohemian place. And she fell into what at the time was considered a sort of evil hippie drug culture, but was involved in a murder. And because of that and the hippie murder, Lucas wrote this story, which was a slightly radical story for the New York Times in that they printed the parts that were about Greenwich, Connecticut in regular Roman type, and the parts that were about Greenwich Village were set in italic type, which was pretty daring for the New York Times at the time. But Lucas started to become disenchanted with working for a day-to-day institutional newspaper like the New York Times. And that really came to a head when they sent him to cover the trial of the Chicago 7. These were the 7 protesters who were accused by the federal government of fomenting a riot at the 1968 Chicago Democratic Convention. As Lucas sat through this trial, he became more and more convinced that this was a political show trial. And he thought that the day-to-day objective journalism of the New York Times was unable to show that. He would talk to his editors, and the editors would say, no, you have to say what the federal government is saying. You put it down in the way that it was said, and then we leave it at that. But he was, of course, also frustrated with some of the family friendliness of the New York Times. The New York Times insisted that they never use dirty words. And so one day when one of the defendants in the trial and you'll have to pardon my language here because I will quote him, stood up and said, "Your Honor, this is bullshit." Lucas said, "This is the story today. This defendant was held in contempt of court because he yelled the word bullshit to the judge at a federal trial. We have to print this." And his editor said, "No, we are a family newspaper. We do not use that word." And so in the end, they decided they would call it a barnyard vulgarity, which became the barnyard epithet on the cover of his book. But if you actually find the story, they called it a barnyard vulgarity. And the New York Times still does this to some extent today. At one point, a former vice president told a New York Times reporter to do something, which the New York Times parlayed into perform an anatomical impossibility on himself. You can figure out what it was that the vice president said. But as Lucas became disenchanted with the Times and this idea of objectivity and institutional reporting, he actually came across a group of reporters in Chicago who had founded the Chicago Journalism Review, which was, prior to Moore, the biggest and most influential of these journalism reviews. And it inspired him to try to do one of these for the New York media. And he thought that by extension, if you have a journalism review about the New York media, you have a journalism review about the national media. Because at that time, the national media was the New York media. That's where it came from. And so he pushed his friend, Dick Pollock, who is this man lying in the grass in the front, who is a former Newsweek press columnist, to become the editor of a new publication. And he said, "Dick, you and I, we have to get together and form this magazine." They called their publishing group Rosebud Associates in a nod to Citizen Kane, the great newspaper publishing movie, and tried to get all of the leading journalists who felt the same way around New York City together. In a little bit of an elite moment, they had their first meeting at the Harvard Club in New York City and brought together a group of reporters who, I will tell you as the person who tried to find out what happened at that meeting, do not remember the meeting at all. I talked to the New Yorker writer Calvin Trillin at one point in doing the research for this book, and I said, "Oh, so you were at the Harvard meeting that formed Moore?" And he said, "I might have been," and he was not very helpful. It was a long time ago. But Pollock and Lucas did a lot of networking, and the one thing they were lacking was funding. And so eventually they had a reporter come and approach them, a young guy who was working for the New York Post. The New York Post at the time was a leftist, almost socialist paper, which is hard to believe now that it is owned by Rupert Murdoch, who has taken it in a very different direction. But at the time it was. And this young man, whose name was Woody Woodward, who is not related to Bob Woodward of Washington Post Watergate fame, said, "Listen, I support what you're doing, and I am the heir to the manufacturer's Hanover fortune, the bank." So he started writing checks, and the three of them became the founders of Moore magazine. So this is Dick Pollock, that's Tony Lucas, they're playing football, and this is the rest of the staff of Moore at a retreat they had on Shelter Island. Does anybody recognize this guy on the top right here? That is a very young Brit Hume, who went on to eventually become a national television correspondent and then a Fox News reporter. But he was the first Washington, D.C. editor of Moore magazine in his younger days. The editors put together a pilot issue. And the pilot issue was coincidentally released in June 1971, which was the same month that the New York Times began publishing the Pentagon Papers. But what they discovered was there really was a market for what they were writing. Moore magazine was a bit of a blend between something satirical, a little bit like a Mad magazine. It was fun, or a Harvard Lampoon, National Lampoon kind of magazine. And on the other hand, the New York Review of Books, something that was high-minded essays about the state of the press. It was press criticism. And we're talking about press criticism tonight, and I think it's important that we distinguish between two different kinds of press criticism. On the one hand, there's what I would call good faith press criticism, and that's what Moore was doing. That's press criticism that takes as granted the idea that an institution like the New York Times is important to society. They want it to do a good job. They want it to be better. They believe in it, and they believe that it's trying hard, but they believe that something like the New York Times is a very big ship to turn around. So they're pushing the New York Times as gadflies to try to become better. They're pushing CBS News. They're pushing Time Magazine and Newsweek to do the best version of reporting that they can. That's what I mean when we talk about press criticism in Moore. There's also what I would call bad faith press criticism, which is the kind of press criticism that says, you shouldn't trust what you read in the press. And doing good faith press criticism is dangerous because it can also open the door to bad faith press criticism, which began to flourish in this same period. The Vice President of the United States, Spiro Agnew, was sort of deputized to become the person who was trying to tear down the press in this same period. And so they're dealing with that a little bit as they go. You can see some of the names who are in the very first issue there: J. Anthony Lucas, Tony Lucas, David Halberstam, Charlotte Curtis, Paul Cowan, George Reedy, a lot of big names. And the cartoon here was by a guy named David Levine, who was a cartoonist for a long time for the New York Review of Books. As they moved on, in the first phase, Moore was printed on very cheap newsprint, and that has made it hard to find, in addition to that word more being difficult to find, because the issues didn't last. It was like trying to keep a newspaper around. A few years after I finished this project, I actually had a retiring journalism professor who had seen the book say, hey, do you want my collection of Moore? I can't keep it in my office anymore. So I have a few of them now, which is great. But it almost always had a cartoon on the front, often by the same cartoonist, Marty Norman. That's that great picture of Nixon breaking through the paper there. And in this period, it was a small, scrappy paper that made almost no money and was supported almost entirely by checks written by Woody Woodward. Their biggest success in these early days was what I'm calling here the gathering of the Gotham media. But they started something called the A.J. Liebling Counter Convention. A.J. Liebling was one of the first regular press critics in the United States, also a spectacular food writer, great boxing writer, did some great World War II reportage for The New Yorker. And they named this conference in honor of A.J. Liebling. And they brought in some of the biggest names in journalism to come to these conferences over the course of about 6 years. Moore had a problem, though, which was the press changed after Watergate, and perceptions of the press changed after Watergate. Suddenly, after Watergate and the release of the Pentagon Papers, people started to say, oh, well, the press gets it. Like, journalism can make real change. Why do we need to make the press change? And so they were constantly navigating that divide between the two. This is probably Marty Norman's most famous drawing. This is a drawing that he did as a poster for one of the these counter conventions with "Hello, sweetheart, get me rewrite." They believed in real reporting. They thought that investigators could do real work. There was a little bit of a backlash to this among a lot of young women reporters who did not like the word sweetheart, particularly as there was a push in the 1970s toward a new wave of feminism. But I'll show you the reaction Marty Norman had to that in a minute. In the book, if you read it, I do a couple of case studies that I won't go into a lot of detail here now because I'm already talking more than I probably should. But the relationship, particularly between Moore and the New York Times, is really fascinating. I make case that Moore is indirectly responsible for the creation of corrections boxes in the New York Times. In the very first issue of Moore, there is a call for corrections boxes that was written at first by someone named George Reedy, who was one of Lyndon Johnson's press secretaries. and said, newspapers should be doing this all the time. We'd trust newspapers more if they corrected themselves, like saying you're no longer the editor of the Journal of Magazine Media. And it took about a year, but eventually the New York Times began doing this. And I was able to trace through some documents that the Moore article is actually the impetus for this happening. Indirectly, but that it did happen. They also spent a long time trying to get the New York Times to change through a Harvard Business School professor who went to the New York Times and tried to reform the management structure of it, which is a story I also tell in this place. Here we've got David Halberstam and Tony Lucas presenting the A.J. Liebling Prize to Homer Biggert, who is a longtime New York Times foreign correspondent. I actually own a book Homer Biggert used to own, judging by the fact that he wrote his name in the front of it. One of my most prized possessions. It is actually a history of the New York Times. But these guys couldn't make any money. The problem with a magazine for and about journalism is that there was nobody to sell ads to. Journalists don't buy anything in particular. And so advertisers aren't all that interested. It's not a big enough general interest magazine to survive with huge circulation, though they tried. They believed this magazine was for anybody who was interested in the news, not just for journalists. But the circulation never got above about 20,000. That was about the peak. So eventually the original trio who owned Moore sold it. The first group they sold it to was a former editor of New York magazine, and he decided to remake it as a media magazine. It becomes a glossy, it gets photographs on the front, they start covering the film business and advertising, and it lasts about a year before that editor also realized he could not make money with this. And he tried to sell it again, and it sold one more time before the end of it. But I think there is a real legacy of press criticism that comes out of it. The really sad sort of coda to this is that Moore, which was a little bit countercultural, a little bit anti-institutional, ended up getting sold to the most institutional of all press journals, the Columbia Journalism Review. So the Columbia Journalism Review actually owns the rights to Moore to this day, which is okay. I am a Columbia journalism grad. It got me a bit of an in to be able to access those archives. But I'll wind up now with the image that Marty Norman came up with in order to answer the feminist critics of the Hello Sweetheart poster. He made this version as a nice response to it. So that is the book, and I'm looking forward to taking the questions about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you.
So I'm curious to start, how many people in the audience have a background in the news? Not as many as I would have expected. So you and I talked about this a little bit before, but as I was finishing the book this weekend, I was taken back to my first day of college, sitting in an auditorium in a basement, listening to an intro to mass communications lecture. And I was there having read All the President's Men. I was a classic newspaper guy. I was going to change the world. And this professor stands up there, and one of the first things out of his mouth is, forget about being objective. It's impossible. It's not going to happen. And that probably more than anything else I heard in my college career shifted my perspective and how I learned. That idea that objectivity and truthfulness are not necessarily intertwined was kind of my introduction to critical thinking at the age of 18. Any thought on that in terms of, in an academic sense?
Yeah, sure. I think probably one of the best thinkers and writers about objectivity in journalism is an NYU professor named Jay Rosen. And he's coined this really useful term that he calls the view from nowhere, which is the voice of institutional journalism. It's like, you might have called it the voice of God, but he doesn't think it's the voice of God. It's not quite that authoritative. It's a point of view of no point of view. And he says you actually lose quite a bit with that. I think I would make the thesis that an institution like the New York Times would actually have an easier time getting people to trust it if they acknowledged what their point of view is. There's a great book that came out about 2-3 years ago called News for the Rich, White, and Blue that looks at the New York Times and other large institutions and says, this is for well-educated, wealthy people who are kind of center-left on the spectrum, of the political spectrum, because the people who are reporting the news are well-educated, they're generally wealthy, they're cosmopolitan, they have a particular view of the world, and the reporting that they're creating comes from that point of view. And it's very hard to read something like the New York Times and not see that. And I'd say that it would make it harder for critics to pick at the New York Times if they said, yeah, that's what we are, than trying to say, we are the definitive report of the news, we don't take sides on things, because they're not. There is a point of view of the New York Times.
So that part that it's ingrained has changed, though, because in the book, in the Watergate era, you talk a lot about how anti-intellectualism was what was holding the newsroom back. At what point did that start to shift, and how did the problems persist even as that issue was rectified?
I would argue that there's a difference between intelligence and intellectualism. I think that the New York Times would be intelligent, but often anti-intellectual. By which I mean, intellectualism it's self-criticism. It's an idea that we're going to investigate why we do the things that we do and asking those kinds of questions. Intelligence is valued too. So if you were going to have surgery, you would probably want an intelligent surgeon as opposed to an intellectual surgeon. The intellectual surgeon is going to be the one who's experimenting, right? The intelligent surgeon is the one who is doing things the best we know how right now. Now you want the researchers who are looking for those new experimental techniques, and that's what I'd push. That's the difference between intelligence and intellectualism there.
Going back to the beginning of the book to start a conversation of the present, but you open your introduction with, you say, this has echoes to a period that has many echoes in contemporary American journalism, a presidential administration openly hostile to the press, a divisive public discourse, and a press that found its established best practices unable to adequately cover new social realities in the country. I don't think anyone here is going to be confused by the comparison of two presidents accused of felonies who openly have tried to vilify the press. And I think we would all agree that to call public discourse today divisive would be an understatement. But can you elaborate a little bit on that last part a little bit? How do the limitations of the press impact their ability to cover the news today?
We could talk for hours about it. I think what a lot of mainstream publications have found is that the techniques of journalism that trust authority, that believe that what people say should be taken at face value, has been found wanting when it comes to describing public discourse today, right? So, trying to think of an example that would work for this. But calling something a lie, it's very difficult for somebody who is trained in the ideas of objectivity and institutional journalism to be able to say, this person is lying to me, or what that person just said is racist, because they know that they're going to get attacked, often by those bad faith press critics, for having had an opinion. And that opinion is not supposed to be part of the news report. So they find themselves very hemmed in and worried about public attacks and bias, which are generally the biggest attacks that you get for the press today.
As we circle this word objective a lot as we move forward, it might be interesting to define that. How would you define objectivity in a newspaper sense?
How do you find, okay, so there are a lot of definitions of objectivity. I mean, one is the sort of scientific definition of objectivity, the idea that there is a truth that exists in the world and that it's the reporter's job to describe that truth without any color. No opinion, not taking into account the background that they bring into it. That's the part that I think your professor freshman year was telling you is just truly impossible to do. There is a working definition of objectivity that I think could work, which is the idea of the reporter essentially as social scientist, that as long as you don't go in with a point of view when you start your reporting, you consider all of the facts that you gather as you're doing that reporting, then it would be okay to come to a conclusion. And there is a definition of objectivity from 100 years ago or so that came to that conclusion, right? That reporters would, as long as they didn't have a particular point of view in mind when they started, could still come to a conclusion about something once they had gathered the facts. We've sort of migrated toward that view from nowhere, that the idea that the reporter is not supposed to come to a conclusion about anything. But really the act of news gathering is always an act of making choices. The moment you decide which person you're going to interview, which fact you're going to put first in your story, you're making judgment calls, you're making value calls about what belongs in your story. And my brother-in-law is a sports writer, and I've had discussions with him at points about whether or not sports writing is political. And I think that the moment you're making decisions, even to say, value college football enough to write about it, you're making a political decision. You're making a decision about what is important in the world and saying, college football is a thing we should care about. So I think that it's very hard to come to any kind of pure objectivity.
So that in the sense that objectivity is overcome, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna move on to the next question.
I'll say another thing that I was thinking about here, right? So we talked about journalism as a social science, and I live in an academic world, largely. And I was trained in a doctoral program where most of the people who study journalism, and this is true really of journalism studies in general, come from the social sciences. This idea that journalism should be studied from the point of view of sociology, trying to understand things on a really broad level. I come from a point of view that journalism can be understood really well also through the humanities. The idea that journalism isn't just about showing larger social structures, but telling us as a people something about how we live. One of my favorite scholars who's written a little bit about press criticism is a guy named James Carey, who he's died, but he was at the University of Illinois and then at Columbia University. And he was very much a humanist when it came to journalism. But he wrote an essay in the 1970s, 1974, saying that we spent so much more time teaching children how to read poetry than we taught them how to read a newspaper report. And yet, as adults, we're consuming so much more news than we're consuming poetry on a day-to-day basis. And he was arguing that we should have a constant culture of criticism, which really is a humanistic activity that was explaining journalism to ourselves. And spending time having these conversations about what journalism tells us about who we are as human beings.
Good news, I'm back on track.
All right, good.
So that talks a little bit then about the problem on the news gathering side. You talk in the book also about the problem on the business side. How do editors, publishers, and newspaper owners perpetuate this idea that objectivity must reign supreme?
Well, it came in large part out of the period when newspapers had local monopolies in the United States. So in the peak era of mass media, we get to a point where, and this is my childhood, there was one newspaper per city, right? So you have a newspaper, that is the one everybody reads. And that meant that as a publisher, you wanted to have a form of news that offended the least amount of people. Because if you wanted to sell the most ads, you didn't want to piss off one side or the other. And so you had a kind of news that played it straight down the middle. So there's a real economic imperative to doing that. Some of it also comes out of the start of the Associated Press in the late 19th century. Because suddenly newspapers were sharing news, all news started to sound the same, very much like the Associated Press did.
So as this modern mass media landscape starts to dominate, and you have this sense of opinion getting in the way, and a lot of other media outlets are not getting in the way, but being used to further a story. There's outlets online, on television, but newspapers kind of remain resistant to this idea. Is that just ingrained at this point?
I think it is ingrained in newspapers. I think it's ingrained in any legacy news organization, as we tend to call it, the ones that existed pre-internet, where that was the assumption. So if you look at something like a national broadcast news network, they're operating under some of those same imperatives that a local newspaper would be, right? If you are CBS News or NBC News, you're not saying you are a left-leaning news organization. You're saying you're a news organization. And so in the period when this book takes place for CBS News, that would have been the Walter Cronkite era, where Walter Cronkite was supposedly the most trusted man in America. And the idea was supposed to be that you could watch Walter Cronkite, and in 22 minutes you would get a picture of all of the news that you needed to know for the day, and that was it. So I think it really is just something that's been handed down. The other thing I'd say, though, is that as we talk about this mainstream news, the big television stations, the major newspapers, there has always been in this country and around the world a tradition of news that doesn't come from an objective standpoint. On the flight here, not because I was coming to Kansas City, but because I happened to be 2 weeks behind in reading the New York Times Magazine, I read a long profile of Taylor Swift. And it's a spectacular story by a really great writer named Taffy Brodesser-Akner. She writes some of the best profiles you'll read. There is nothing objective about this story. It's in the New York Times Magazine, which is a slightly separate piece of the New York Times, but it is about her. It takes place in her head. She talks about her son, who was at a Taylor Swift concert with her. She talks about the people who are around her and her opinions and the effect that Taylor Swift's music has on her. And whatever you think of Taylor Swift, you get a really good portrait of Taylor Swift through the eyes of Taffy Brodesser-Akner. Now, it's her point of view, and I enjoy reading her point of view, and there are other ways to look at Taylor Swift. There are lots of ways to look at Taylor Swift, but having that human point of view and seeing it through that one writer's brain, I think is also a really valuable way to see things. That other tradition of non-objective journalism.
You closed the book talking about the legacy and the changes that more can be credited for. You spent a lot of time on the correction box. Can you tell that story? How did that come about?
Sure. So in the very first issue of More, that pilot issue, George Reedy, the former Lyndon Johnson press secretary, who went on to become a journalism professor at Marquette University in Milwaukee, he wrote a long essay that was a response to another essay criticizing the press. And he said one of the things that the press should do is constantly correct itself. That we would have more trust in a press that said, we got this wrong yesterday, we want to make sure it's correct, you're going to trust us because we are acknowledging our own mistakes. And from the very first issue, More dedicated itself to having a corrections box. So every month that More came out, there was a corrections box in the front, and they challenged other publications to do the same. The way this ended up making it into the New York Times was a little bit convoluted, but the more staid, less anti-institutional Columbia Journalism Review picked up on something More had said about a year earlier. And the New York Times, to its credit, was busy with dealing with the Pentagon Papers in 1971. So they had other things on their mind besides starting a corrections box. But the Columbia Journalism Review writer actually wrote to Abe Rosenthal, who was the editor of the New York Times, and said, hey, Abe, wouldn't it be great if you started running a corrections box because of this story that had been in More a year earlier? And Rosenthal literally did it within a week. After that, they had mocked up a couple of ways that it might run and started running it shortly after that. And in this period, when the New York Times is becoming a national powerhouse news organization, all of the other regional papers sort of followed suit. Although you could give credit to the Louisville Courier-Journal, which seems to have done it first.
I don't recall if you questioned or if you were mentioning that somebody else questioned in the book, but some question as to whether or not it was legitimately about making sure that they were presenting accurate information or just protecting the institutional identity of the newspaper through some sort of an illusion.
Well, it's a little bit of theater, right? It's self-criticism theater. They're not catching everything. They're largely talking about little mistakes, right? We misspelled an actress's name yesterday. It's not really about taking themselves to task for larger stories. 20 years ago or so, when the New York Times caught one of its reporters, Jason Blair, making up large parts of his story, plagiarizing from other people, they actually did something very similar to this and wrote about a 10,000 word story investigating themselves. So there is some real self-criticism that goes on in this. And just this week, the New York Times actually published a note from the editor criticizing itself for its coverage of the rocket attack on the hospital in Gaza, and said, we jumped to conclusions too fast, we don't know all of the facts, we were moving too quickly. Partly that, something like that is because the news cycle moves so quickly now, right? The New York Times is not a daily newspaper anymore. It is a whenever a story happens newspaper. And so news stories get rewritten. We don't know it's become very clear that we don't know all the facts from the very beginning in a way that's always been true. It was just easier to ignore the mistakes in yesterday's paper because you couldn't find yesterday's paper. And it had become, as they say, fish wrap or lining a bird cage.
So other than that, there aren't a whole lot of things that you can point to with any concrete evidence and say more magazines said this, so the media did that. But clearly they were having a lot of conversations that we're still having today. Is that the bigger impact, is furthering those conversations?
Yeah, I think, so James Carey, the professor I mentioned before, actually has a metaphor where he says that journalism and media more largely are the conversation we have with each other about public affairs. That the reason we have media is because as a society we've become too big to know each other and to be able to talk to each other all the time. And so it's the role of the press to have that conversation. But I think it's also important that we're always having a conversation about the press. And for a long time, conversations like that seem to be happening in social media. Social media has become a much more toxic place recently. And it's become hard to know if those conversations are still happening. If you had asked me 5 years ago, or 4 years ago when the hardcover version of this book came out, I would have been more optimistic that we are actually living in a golden age of press criticism, where people are looking at stories and saying, this was good, this was bad, we need to move this story in another direction. It's become much more partisan and toxic now, I would say.
So I want to go to some audience questions, but as you all frame what those might be, one of the other things that Moore did was to kind of put their money where their mouth was and publish things that other people wouldn't publish. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Murdoch story, because I think this is a really good example of why it's not enough for the media to tell the truth. We also need a public that's willing to hear it and accept it.
Yeah. So one of the ideas that Moore committed itself to early on was publishing stories that had been written for other publications, but then in very violent journalistic lingo had been killed or spiked. Editors used to have these giant spikes on their desks, and they would literally spike a stack of papers on them. But reporters talked about these all the time at the bar. A magazine would commission a 20,000 word story. They were going to pay you 50 cents a word. It was a lot of money. But then you turned in your copy and the editor didn't like it. And so they would usually pay you what's called a kill fee, where you'd get half the price. But your story never got published. And so the reporters would share with each other, well, I did all this great work, the editor didn't like it. The story about Murdoch was actually a story that a couple of journalists who were actually Australian had written about Rupert Murdoch in 1976, when he was first coming to the United States. He was a much younger man in 1976. He was an unknown quantity to some extent. He'd been a newspaper publisher in Australia and in England, but then he started buying up properties in New York. So New York Magazine, which despite its name was really a national magazine, commissioned this profile. Who is Rupert Murdoch? What is this man? And the reporters did all the work and they turned it into New York Magazine, and New York Magazine was sold. Rupert Murdoch. And he immediately killed that story. But More ran it on their front cover and gave us really the first view of what Rupert Murdoch would become, and an idea of this press mogul who we've known for the last 50 years.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but that really is a beautifully written passage. Would you mind reading that?
Sure.
It's page 199 in mine. I don't know if it's going to be the same in the
Yeah, I think
hardcover
it's
or
the same
not.
in the hardcover.
But that reporter did such a great job on that. I think they deserve to hear that.
Oh, the quote?
The one day in March.
Yep. One day in March 1964, a bewildered migrant walked into the offices of Murdoch's Daily Mirror, clutching his daughter's diary in his hand. Appalled by what he had read, he sought advice from the seemingly omnipotent arbiters of community taste. For other reasons, the Mirror shared the migrant's concerns and decided to print the contents of the little red book on its front page, : "Sex outrage in school lunch break," the Mirror blared. Reproduced passages of the girl's diary spoke of secret rendezvous and sexual encounters with schoolmates. As a result of the publicity, the 14-year-old girl and her, quote, boyfriend, Digby Bamford, were expelled from school. And for Murdoch's readers, that is where the story ended. It was never reported that the following day, young Digby Bamford was found hanging from a clothesline in his backyard. Nor was it ever reported that a pathologist from the Children's Welfare Department filed a report of the incident in which he stated that the 14-year-old girl was still a virgin. Only Richard Neville's obscene publication, Oz, printed the whole story at the time.
And you add here, the subhead to the More story asks, is this the future? And the answer, of course, is yes. Yes, it is.
Yep.
Questions from you all? What did I miss that you would like to know?
I've always thought that the way to get out of something is to plead guilty for what you're guilty of, and plead not guilty what you're not guilty of. And the point I'm going to make about journalism is, going through the 60s and the 70s, it was pretty much social liberalism as opposed to economic liberalism. And you mentioned, urban sophisticates or left of center on social issues. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're left of center on economic issues. Conversely, you can go down to State Fair where the farmers all do their thing. They're very conservative about things like, co-ed dorms or something like that, but they're fairly liberal on government spending, especially for farm supports and things like that. The point is that I'm trying to make, and get your thoughts on this, if we could do a better job of delineating between social and economic liberalism or conservatism, and break that down and make people understand, just because you sound like a right-winger on one issue don't necessarily mean that you're the way that, if you're an activist against sex education, you might still be damn near socialist when it comes to, say, farm price supports. And so could we do a better job of delineating between social and economics on left and right?
Sure, I think I'll broaden that a little bit and say that one of the complaints that the writers and editors of More always had was that journalism is not good with subtlety and nuance, and that it's much easier to put somebody into a category and say, this is where this person falls, say, on a left-right spectrum, and to call somebody a liberal or a conservative or a progressive or a centrist doesn't begin to encapsulate a human being and the thoughts that they have on something. And so this was a problem with journalism, right? Daily journalism doesn't give you a lot of space. And so journalists resort to, I'm going to use a word that actually the columnist and critic Walter Lippmann coined, which is stereotype. Stereotypes are quick ways of understanding things. And stereotype actually comes from a printing process. And in the 1920s, when he wrote his great book, Public Opinion, which still holds up today in a lot of ways as a work of press criticism, he coined that term and said, journalism doesn't do nuance well. Journalism is not good at explaining things in a lot of detail. Now, some of it is. You could read a lot of really great long-form magazine writing that does delve into nuance, that tries to tease out what a particular politician thinks about a whole range of issues. But in daily journalism or social media, where you've got a small number of characters to use, it's much, much easier to just say, that person's a left-winger, that person's a right-winger, that person's a centrist, and assume that the cluster of ideas is going to match.
I've got three if we have time.
Sure.
Talking about objectivity. If you're going to describe newspapers to a young person and then tell them they're not objective, why should they ever read a newspaper?
Well, one, they don't. Sure. Yeah, I mean, my students' parents at this point have almost never read a print newspaper. And newspaper it's a not very useful term anymore because so few of us read newspapers. Even today, I was reading magazines on the airplane on the way here, and I accidentally pulled out the safety information card, and I said, "Oh, they got stuck in my magazines." And the woman who was sitting a seat over said, "I haven't read a magazine in years." Which is true, and she told me she was a school teacher, right? She was a retired high school teacher. And, you know, that's a little bit sad, but I think it's also the truth. Now, that doesn't mean she hasn't read magazine form journalism, but why should a student read a newspaper? A student shouldn't necessarily read a newspaper. I'm not sure newspapers are the future. The omnibus news report that something like a newspaper represents is kind of falling apart as both an economic and a cultural model. You know, people weren't buying newspapers because they wanted to read the latest report on the school board meeting. But they might accidentally come across the school board meeting because they wanted Monday morning's recap of the Chiefs game. And things like sports, you can get somewhere other than a newspaper now. You didn't have to buy it. Advertising exists in places other than newspapers. So people used to buy the Sunday newspaper just for the advertisements or the coupons. I think we have a little bit of a myth of a golden age of newspapers where everybody was reading newspapers and we were all really well informed. I don't think that was really true. And people are getting their news in different ways. Students are getting news in little chunks from social media or from Apple News on their phones. There is still curation. I'm a little more concerned about algorithmic curation, where they get fed more and more of the things they click on. I think that's a really dangerous kind of thing. I think that people should be exposed to ideas they don't like. But it's hard to make yourself do that in a world where you're not reading something like an omnibus newspaper.
No one else is up. We're going to go to
You have one young woman, I think, behind you that wanted to sneak in a question, and then
I'll wait after her.
Sure.
If my question is irrelevant to the topic, please just say so. I am really torn because back in the early 80s when Reagan was president was when Congress decided and he signed that you no longer had to provide a balanced approach to news, the fairness doctrine.
The FCC revoking the fairness doctrine.
And frankly, I think we're desperate for it.
The fairness doctrine it's a difficult thing because it would mostly apply to broadcast. And what you're looking at is if you give 20 minutes to the Democrat, you have to give 20 minutes to the Republican to respond, and that there was an equal time on this. And the the fact that the fairness doctrine went away in the 80s has allowed for things like the rise of conservative media, the rise of liberal media, where you're not required, say, as a radio station, to have as much time for the Democratic point of view as you have for the Republican point of view. One of the classes I teach fairly regularly is mass communication law, and for a long time I would say that I was a First Amendment absolutist, that I believe that the cure for speech you don't like is more speech. I find it harder to hold that position in a time of social media, where particular voices get amplified, particular toxic voices get amplified. And I don't mean that on one political side of the spectrum or another necessarily. I just mean that the conversations that go on in social media, where a lot of journalists spend a lot of their time, are really quite nasty and vile. And I would tell you not to go read them. But I don't know that I have an answer to that in a world where we have freedom of speech, because I don't know that you can require everyone to have some kind, in a just world, all of the voices would be amplified to the extent that they are voices in the regular conversation. But I don't know how you can make that happen. And the internet has made it so that previously sidelined voices are louder. And that has been good for marginalized communities that felt like they didn't have a voice, but it's also been bad for rightly marginalized communities that shouldn't have as large a voice. And I don't know how you amplify one without amplifying the other. I don't have an answer to that.
I think civics classes.
I think civics classes,
Ways with that, especially if they were required classes for all the students.
and I think one of the things that civics classes, and I think also media literacy. One of the things I try to do with my students is teach them how to consume media as critical consumers of the media, thinking about where the news comes from, because Jay Rosen calls it the voice from nowhere, but news doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from people who are creating news. News is a cultural creation, and it's a reflection of what is going on in society more generally. But yeah, I mean, I agree that civic education is an important part of that.
We're coming up on 7 o'clock, so I'm going to ask if you would kindly choose maybe one of your final two questions. What's the better of the two? If anybody does have other questions, Kevin will be signing books out front when we're done here, and we'll be happy to ask answer
Yes,
questions.
there's someone else has a different question.
I was just going to say real quick, and I know it's illegal to have two questions, but here goes. I used to remember as a kid, they had people married their beat, so to speak. They had agricultural journalists, they had labor journalists, they had journalists who were experts in what they were covering. And one of the things that I learned at the State Fair is how infuriated ag people are that the journalists that interview them have not the slightest idea about anything they do. And it's not just agriculture, it's labor, military, whatever, and that you should have more journalists who are expertise in what they happen to be covering. Do you think that's worthwhile, something to think about?
I do. I would say that the reason it's happening is economic. It is very hard to have journalists who are experts in things. There are expert agricultural journalists. There are expert scientific journalists. There are expert labor journalists. One of my best friends, her beat is the art market. All she covers is the art market for the Wall Street Journal. And she writes, and she knows about that, and that is what she has done for over a decade. And you know, she's not an artist, but she understands that world and she speaks in the same language. And I think it's really important for journalists to be able to do that. I understand the frustration of a source who thinks that a journalist doesn't understand them. And to some extent that comes from devaluing those specialized beats and not having enough funding to say, like, well, we need somebody who's going to cover it. But there are certainly agricultural magazines. There are a lot of great farming magazines where I'm sure the editors who work there know everything about those fields. Yeah, it is, absolutely.
Go ahead. You're lucky, this is one of the topics I could listen to people talk about forever.
Good. Freedom of speech. When I was in grade school, we were taught there's no such thing as absolute freedom of speech. The example they always drilled into us, you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. Now, there's a very important case about coming to the Supreme Court this year, basically dealing with that very same issue. Is there an absolute freedom of speech? And I'd kind of like to hear what you think about this case.
Sure. I agree there is no absolute freedom of speech. And I will tell you that when you teach mass communication law, there isn't. I will also say, and I'm going to forget whether it was Oliver Wendell Holmes or Louis Brandeis who wrote the decision. They went back and forth in the 1920s writing the great freedom of speech dissents and then Supreme Court decisions. I want to say it was Brandeis who wrote the fire in a crowded theater metaphor, and then later very much regretted it because it didn't say what he actually meant. What he meant to say was what later became codified as what's called imminent lawless action. The speech-action divide in freedom of speech. You are allowed to say whatever you want as long as it doesn't push him over into incitement, right? So you can get a crowd riled up, but then if you say, now let's go burn them with torches and stab them with pitchforks, then it becomes incitement and has moved over into being illegal. That's what he was trying to say with the fire in a crowded theater thing. But without commenting on any specific case, I do agree that there is no such thing as complete freedom of speech. You can't have it. You can get very close to it, but extortion is technically speech, and it is illegal. Libel is technically speech, and it's illegal. Child pornography would technically be speech, and it's very illegal. And I don't think I'm sure there are some people who would defend those things, but no one who is a member of society would defend those things publicly. There are limitations on speech.
You remember the case that fire in the theater metaphor came from?
I don't remember the exact name of the...
It was the draft card case, right? The burning the draft cards?
Is that the one? I believe it was from Bank versus US, but it was one of the 19-teens cases that came out of draft resistors to World War I. Yeah.
Well, Kevin, thank you very much for being here.
Well, thank you.
Really enjoyed the book. Thank you all. Please check it out.
Thank you.